Design the system, not the hero. If success depends on your personal heroics, it will never scale.
Today's guest is Andrew Stevens, serial tech entrepreneur with 30 years of building, scaling, and selling companies, now CTO of Sakura Sky. His framework for building trustworthy AI agents is redefining how enterprises deploy AI safely at scale.
I was in a motorcycle accident in 2006. I ended up in intensive care. There was so much pointed at me and so much dependent on me showing up every day. Scale is really about building a system that makes good decisions without you. And that was a really tough lesson for me, where I thought I had to be hands-on on everything. Resilience is built, not wished for. Designing for perfection is where I started, but today I design for resilience.
With these AI tools these days, leaders kind of like drag back into being hands-on. So what advice leaders should do?
Trust comes from observability. If you can't see it, you can't improve it. You need to have those guardrails. Being able to scale your company is really about trust. It's about data, it's about trust. And it's also about leaning into the people around you.
The other thing in the executive's mind is actually building an AI-ready organization, right?
AI is a great amplifier. If you're really good at what you do, AI is going to make it better. If you're not so good at what you do, AI is really going to expose that to your audience. AI is just a new software pattern, and an LLM is just a new user interface. We need to become familiar with this new agentic AI software architecture. The fastest team are the people that can make decisions safely. It's not the people without rules, it's the people with rules that can be applied the fastest. Governance isn't a gate, it's a guardrail that lets you get there faster. And the reason why you put brakes on your Ferrari is so you can drive it fast. If you didn't have brakes on that Ferrari, it's not going to go very fast.
Hey, quick pause. My goal with Tech Lead Journal is simple. Learn from the best in tech so we can all grow together. If this resonates with you, hit subscribe to follow the channel. It's the biggest way for you to support the show and help us keep bringing great guests and insights to you. Thanks for being here, and let's get back to it. Hello, welcome back to another new episode of Tech Lead Journal podcast. Today, I'm very excited to have someone who has decades of experience, building companies, scaling companies, selling companies as well. So his name is Andrew Stevens. I think today he's going to share a lot of learnings from his journey. And obviously not to mention things about AI, which is what he's doing now with Sakura Sky, his company. So Andrew, welcome to the show. Really looking forward for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. Great to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Yeah, look, my background goes back a long way now, so hopefully we can find something interesting to chat about today, and I'm looking forward to seeing where we go.
Yeah. So when I look at your profile, I mean, it says like you have 30 plus years of experience. You have a lot of experience building companies, scaling companies, selling companies, and not just as a tech practitioners, but also at the leadership position. Like CTO, contractors, consultants, and all that. So I think the first thing that I'd like to probably learn from you, you have gone through this journey, building startups from 0 to 1, 1 to 10, and N, going, up to selling the companies. So I think maybe you can start, like, bring up some topics that you think could be, a good learning points from you to teach us.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I started off, luckily, I guess, in the early 90s is really where my IT career started. So it's been a long time now. So, I came through working in university. I've gone through working at software companies. I've worked for manufacturing companies. I've sat on the train to and from work every day when I had a long commute, and I was coding on the train to try. Really, really believed in. So, it's been a great journey. And sometimes I look back at these things and think, oh my God, my laptop out now in some of the places I've lived in. I've lived in New York City. I've lived in San Francisco. I'd never put my laptop out in those places. But, back in the 90s, it was so exciting and new to get caught up in this internet thing. And, I started in the early days, and I really wanted to learn about how dial-up internet worked. And I heard about this new thing called Linux, and I got really involved in that. And it's so exciting, and built, just a couple of friends and I, we built a dial-up internet company, and we sold that. And that was really just three guys sitting around eating pizza and coding on a weekend or after work. And that was so much fun, right? There was the opportunity to explore new ideas, and it was a safe place to build something, fail terribly, because, I remember my first order off Amazon.com, right? I bought a Pearl book, and I think it was a Camel book way back then. And I looked at it and I couldn't buy it in Australia for less than like a couple of $100, but I could buy it off Amazon in the US for like 60 Australian dollars. But it took 6 months to come via sea freight. And it was a long time. And when it finally arrived, it was amazing to get it. But then I went out immediately and canceled my credit cards. I thought, oh my God, I've given my credit card away to this unknown company. Nowadays, people look at that and laugh and think, Amazon's a household name. And I think that journey is amazing to see the trust that's built with the internet. And, companies such as Amazon, whatever you may think of things now, but they spend a lot of time to build that trust. They built those systems. And I think that really talks about what we need to be thinking about as engineers and founders as well. And being able to scale your company is really about trust. It's about data. It's about trust. And it's also about leaning into the people around you and their expertise and really discovering what others around you can add. And, in the early days, it was really, for me, about being the most knowledgeable Perl programmer, the PHP programmer, Cold Fusion, whatever I wrote. And nowadays, I love Rust and Golang. But back then it was Perl, and that's what I did. And that's why I stuck my notes down. And I really thought I added value strictly through my ability to commit code. And there wasn't Git back then, committing code and pushing the needle more. And as time grew, you find out other values in yourself and those other values of people around you. And really success is built through, trusting. And trust is a lot. It's not only you trusting your business partner or your team, it's also your customer trusting you. And you need to build those systems and methods for them to build you. So really going from nothing, like I'm sitting by myself, I want to build something, the founder as an engineer sort of paradigm, right? It's really about speed and innovation and getting something out. And nowadays people talk about product market fit, and I'm not seeing conversations about MVP as much anymore, but it's all about PMF and, how do you get there? Back then, how do I get there? And it's easy when you're a team of one, but you'll never reach scale. And scale is not just about people. It's about your customers. It's about your reach. It's about more than that. When how do you scale from 0 to 1 and 1 to many is another thing as well. And you really find things that break. One of my early companies I built, we went from 2 of us and we hit over 100 people. And I had people in Malaysia, I had people in the Philippines, I had people in Australia. And just scaling that was difficult. Decision systems break. Staying centralized and making everything founder-led is great to a degree, but when you've got people in different time zones and different skill sets, you're not going to be the expert in the room every time. So you need to build a way to trust those people. Teams sitting around waiting for your approvals are not good either. Context gets lost, speed drops. And, if you're the founder and you're in every single meeting, in the early days, that's okay. But once you hit a certain size and speed, it's difficult. So I think there's a lot. So it's all about communication. Scale isn't about adding people. Scale is really about building a system that makes good decisions without you. And that was a really tough lesson for me to learn in the early days, where I thought I had to be hands-on on everything and only I knew the product. Only I knew that line of code. But, there's a lot more to it than that. So, I think some of those things that breaks at scale, I think you'll find it fairly quickly. Sorry, Henry, I've been chatting too much.
Yeah, so thank you for sharing some of the interesting stuff that you have gone through throughout your journey, right? I want to pick one thing that you mentioned earlier, which I find really interesting, especially in this era, right? So we can validate it. So you mentioned that these days people less talking about MVP, building MVP, but more towards product market fit, PMF, some people call it. And now also with the advent of AI, right? So I think building MVP is arguably simpler. There are so many vibe coding tools these days, like Replit, Lovable, Bolt, and all that. So I think building MVP might not be a challenge anymore these days. So tell us maybe this shift, what you see for people who are starting up startups, like building new products, right? What about PMF that you want to tell those people so that they can actually shift their focus instead of just building MVP, but also think about the PMF aspect?
Yeah, I think scale and trust, everything. AI is a great amplifier. If you're really good at what you do, AI is going to make it better. If you're not so good at what you do, AI is really going to expose that to your audience. And they know PMF, or product market fit, within the age of AI is less about novelty and building something new, I guess, It's more about repeatability. Can you deliver the same outcome? Can you deliver it safely? Will it happen every time? I've been in demos with AI models where it literally worked 15 minutes before the demo, come in, turned it on, and the prompt was slightly different or something, and suddenly I got a very unexpected response. And it's been a terrible experience for myself, being a terrible experience for the product, being a terrible experience for the user, the customer. Guardrails and repeatable outcomes are really what AI nowadays is about. So, it's great to scaffold an idea with, Claude or something, or, I'll have my ID open with, sorry, my cat's decided to join me. So, apologies. It's about, Claude can help you build code really quickly, or Gemini or Codex or whatever. But, I use that for scaffolding. I use that to demonstrate value quickly. I use that to demonstrate or explore an idea. But for me, I don't take that code to production. That's great for understanding what I can achieve, but it's not great for scaling necessarily, right? It's learned from Stack Overflow, it's learned from Reddit, and while it might have some great, it's learned from open source and GitHub, whatever. Apologies to open source people. It's learned from those things, that it's not necessarily picked up the right habits, and it's learned at scale on some bad patterns. And the difference between a good product and an AI product is going to become more and more amplified. We're going to see what a good engineer brings to a product developed by AI. It's going to be probably more secure. It's going to be scalable differently, because, an AI tool is only as good as its prompt and its training material, right? And it's still still probabilistic in terms of what it outputs. And this is why I don't feel necessarily at threat from my role in technology today, because the day that all my customers or all of my users can express what they want succinctly or in totality to an AI to get what they want, is a day that I probably am at risk. And we all know the reality is that business requirements change, market conditions change. Customers will see something and realize new value, or when you produce a bit of code, you'll actually spin it up, look at it and go, oh, if I did that, I can make it better, right? And AI can't necessarily do that. And sure, you can instruct it to do a little bit more, but it's like drip feeding, and you're not going to have that push of quality or whatever into production. So there is definitely a great gap between what AI is producing and what you can produce as a skilled engineer. What I think the risk is for people at the moment, and I'm seeing it a lot, is people are employing less juniors. And that, I think, is a real risk for the industry, because those juniors aren't being trained, and in 5 years' time, who's going to be the seniors? And that, I think, is a risk for the IT industry in general. I used to worry that the hyperscalers and that, or even Microsoft or anyone producing operating system, is gobbling up the people that are capable of producing good operating systems. How hard is it today to actually produce a startup that scales without going to a hyperscaler? We end up by paying the people that will eventually end up by competing with to deliver our products. And there's a certain amount of work we need to do as engineers and professionals in our field to really understand our technology, and that's always on us. But we also need to understand the realities of the business, that if I'm going out there and I'm scaling my product, how am I going to get that? And what's the payoff point, right? I mean, there's a reason why Meta, for example, are not in Google Cloud or in Amazon, because there's obviously a point in time where, the cost of using a hyperscaler cloud is less cost effective than doing it yourself. And understanding those points of inflection for you as an engineer or somebody building a product is really essential. You need to know those points in your time frame. And sometimes working with AI is not going to help you. It might give you some ideas, but you need to be really hands-on at the wheel and understand. So my IDE, I have Codex on one side, I have Gemini Enterprise on the other. I'll get one to help me plan a product, or plan a brief or plan it. Then I'll have the other one review it. Then I'll have one scaffold it for me, and then I'll have the other one check my scaffolding versus my brief. So I'll dual my AIs to try and get the best out of it. And I've tried a lot, and there's a lot of AIs I haven't tried yet, but I'll continue to use them. So I love AI as a productivity tool, but it's not a production tool. Code that goes into production. It'll help me get there, but I would never push my code blanket into production.
Yeah.
Again, I've gone off on a big tangent, but around product market fit, why are startups dying in that space? A lot of them are building what I consider a demo and not a product, right? Some people are building just a simple wrapper around an LLM, and an LLM is not an AI system. An LLM to me, agentic AI is just a new software pattern, right? And an LLM is just a new user interface. We, as architects or engineers, need to become familiar with this new agentic AI software architecture, like microservices, like, our client server, going back further. It's just a new software architecture that we need to understand. And we need to understand this new way of users interacting with software. And LLM, chat interface is a new way to do it. I'm seeing some great outcomes in the data space where people have been spending, months trying to get reports pixel perfect, getting the right bar chart or something. And in a deterministic agentic AI space, you should be able to query your data sets in natural language and get the results in the format that I want through agentic AI, rather than doing a necessarily complex dashboard. But the trick is most people don't know how to do the deterministic agentic AI at the moment, and they're all stuck in probabilistic AI, getting changed answers every time and getting some terrible outcomes. So taking that step up is where we all need to be focused. It is possible, and it is happening, and I'm seeing it. So in fact, one of the products I've worked on recently, it's in a highly regulated financial industry in the European Union. It's passed audit. It is compliant with the GDPR. It is deterministic. It's in banking, so people can get the exact specific data in a repeatable fashion. It's explainable, so you get the exact SQL query executed on your data, and you get the exact outcome. So those are things. So don't ship a demo. Ship a product when you're thinking about PMF. And another thing people thinking about. Oh, sorry, Henry. Go. I was just going to say, people focus on the next model and not about better workflows and better channels.
Yeah, sorry to disrupt. So one thing that I find really interesting these days, right? So people are so easy to build something, like thinking about what you're saying, right? Building demos and all that. And in fact, many of those things are just wrappers on top of LLM, because, the LLM models are still improving by a lot, I guess, although it's kind of like slowing down a bit lately. But arguably, I mean, these LLM models are so powerful, and then people are building on top of it. And there's so many competitions. Like, for example, if you innovate one type of product today, I'm sure tomorrow or next week or so, other people can replicate such similar product in a fast manner, right? So tell us, how do you actually advise startup or leaders, right, to actually build some kind of moat when they build, their PMF?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of discussion lately about this moat, and it's becoming more and more discussed. I see it going through Reddit. I see it going through LinkedIn, and I'm seeing people on two sides of the discussion. I do believe data is a moat, and the trust. So with good data comes good trust. If I can trust I'm getting the right data from my system, I'm always going to go back to the system and try it again, right? But if I get one single query goes wrong, people don't trust your system anymore. And that's where it gets down to. And that's the kind of trust I'm talking about. Can people trust your software to come up with a good response? And for me, it's about finding the right data that really makes your platform or your offering unique. I'm working with one person at the moment where they've got a very unique audience and they've got excellent data. No one else on the planet has it. And rather than focusing on that, which they should be doing, they're focusing more on competing with people that have less focus or less generic, more generic adoption in the industry. And they've got a very strong market position. And they should be out there telling their upstream suppliers or their upstream partners that they own the audience, and this is the data that we can get. I think Tim Berners-Lee said something along the lines of, software comes and goes, but it's data that persists between systems. And you can Google that. I can't remember the exact quote right off the top of my head right now, but data is what comes and what stays. Software comes and goes. And that was actually, I think, another moment for me in my career. I'd write a system, I'd write it what I think was perfect. And then I realized like 4 years later, it's not perfect anymore. It's terrible. It's old, it's slow, doesn't follow the nearest frameworks, it's not deployed properly anymore. So everything I do is transient. But my software something I bought 5 years ago can still help drive AI today as to my behaviors. So, data is there, and that's the moat to focus on. What is a unique offering around the data space that you've got? What is a unique interface that you can offer? People are saying SaaS is dead as well. So I do see a lot of competition and attacking SaaS, I guess. Is it? I don't know. Can I build such SaaS-like software? I can build stuff very quickly now. But can I scale it? Maybe not. Can I pick up my old data? I've got to work and sit down and go through that. So yeah, it's all about data, the moat for me still today.
Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out, right? Because in these days, right, where in fact, building LLM itself is not particularly a moat anymore, right? Because you think it is such a novel thing that only smart people can build, but actually there are thousands of models available if you just see in Hugging Face. So people are building open source version, people are building, like big models and all that. So I guess like the LLM itself is not necessarily a mode these days. So I think what you're mentioning, building on top of data, and trust, right? So building applications that people trust, people want to use, I think is still the key. So maybe let's switch channel a little bit. I want to talk about your leadership journey because I think it's very, very interesting, right? So one in particular thing, I think, especially in those early days, you mentioned early as well, that you tend to be hands-on. You want to be involved, in your leadership, right? You want to know everything, but obviously throughout, your journey, you realize that doesn't scale, right? And typically this is something that is a major bottleneck in any kind of startup that is growing, especially rapidly growing. So tell us why it's such an important thing for leaders to be slightly more hands-off. And in this AI era, especially, some leaders are kind of like enticed back to be more hands-on simply because AI can help them more to be hands-on. So what's your take about this?
Yeah, look, I think I can think of three things in there. One, I'm working with one organization today that the CEO is in every meeting, and they've become a real bottleneck that they can't scale, right? No one feels empowered to make a decision. The CEO doesn't trust the people that they work with to make a decision. They feel that nobody else can do it but them. So why have senior people? You might as well cut the senior team and get like juniors and AI to do that task, right? There's no need, and you probably have great outcomes that way as well. But if you have people you work with, you need to enable them. They need to feel empowered to make decisions, and that's often a very tough thing to let go of as a founder, right? Because it's your baby, and you've worked on it, and it's such a moment of trust. And I struggle with that trust every day. I love it now because every moment I feel I need to focus on the trust between myself and other people, I go, well, what's a real risk here? And I constantly analyze my risk. And, I work very hard to make sure that the people that I'm with are empowered to make decisions. And, if I can't enable that for them, I'll be disappointed myself. So it's something I try and aim for. Some things that really changed for me, I was in a motorcycle accident in 2006. And, I was on my way home from work. Someone else ran a stop sign. It took me out. I ended up in intensive care, all that kind of stuff, long time. And my business partners had a tough time picking up from where I was. I lost value in my investments. I lost value in my companies. And a whole bunch of things happened in 2006 because of this exact moment. And that was, for me, quite an inflection point because I realized then there was so much pointed at me and so much dependent on me showing up every day that I could never have a holiday. I could never, take a moment out, and which was fine. I was in my early 30s and I was enjoying, the center of attention. I hate to think of it like that, but I loved the high intensity. I loved getting on the whiteboard. I loved drawing up that diagram. I loved hearing that problem. And you know what? I can still do that today, but I can also enable the people around me to be involved and take ownership of that and scale. Because the moment, and that I was saying is, if someone gets hit by a bus, it happens. And that inflection point is important. So for me, what changed for me was my relationship with risk, right? So I'm a risk. How do I de-risk my business and how do I de-risk my idea? It's my idea. If it's great, is only going to succeed if other people can get involved, right? And that's the only way I can scale it. And it's the only way that I can de-risk the adoption. I can de-risk that happening. What did I learn? Resilience is built, not wished for. So, the business was only resilient as I am. And if I'm taken out, the business folded. So that for me definitely changed. So nowadays I try and design environments for people to fail safely in. If you can't feel like you can push the envelope and have an outcome, whether that be a good or a bad outcome in an environment, you can never really find the boundaries of where you can push, right? That's why scientists, the scientific method, people push, experiments fail. And that allows them to find out the boundaries of the scientific knowledge. And I think that's true for engineering as well. So, when you're pushing for that, you really got to push forward and change things. So, and I had another idea. I've completely slipped my mind now, but those are the sorts of things that you need to be thinking of for sure.
Yeah, I love your quote, right? Resilience is built, not something that you wish for, not something that it could happen, as you go through tough time, but you actually need to practice, train, build a system, guardrails to build the resilience within your company, not just individually, right? So I think building fail-safe environment also quite important because, no matter where you are, if you are not feeling safe, I think people are not thriving as well because they are just fearing of their, maybe job, their career and all that. I think it's really important. So one question that you haven't actually answered is about, with these AI tools these days, leaders maybe kind of like dragged back into being hands-on. So what advice that you think leaders should do in order to balance, the trade-off being hands-on and also trusting other people to actually do the things?
My secret on this is I'm still hands-on. Every day I still code, right? I can't relate to my engineering team if I can't understand the latest tool. I can't understand the code, and I do that not to pry on them. I do it in a way that I can have a conversation I can contribute to. So recently, some of my hands-on work for one customer or one thing I'm involved in is declining. So I founded a new startup in January this year. So like 4 weeks ago. And for me, it's a high security environment. It's all about workflows to handle inbound security research reach outs. So, if somebody finds a vulnerability in your software system, how do they report that? How do they prove that and make that easy? And a lot of people get these emails and they panic and they go, oh my God, they found a flaw. And, is it real? Is it not real? Is this person trying to rip me off? They're asking for a bounty. How do you manage that? So, I've looked at how HackerOne do it. I've looked at how all these other tools do it. And I thought, well, I could probably do something different. And I'm not aiming for the big end of town. I'm aiming for the small to medium enterprise, mostly mid-market, and looking at that. And for me, that's my way to 2026. I'm going to apply my knowledge, my hands-on, and I'm going to use that as a way for me to understand my teams. And I will always do that. So my recommendation for someone who has been a technical person now in leadership, maintain your code. You don't necessarily need to do it in things that are related to the role directly, but you need to be in technology. You need to be hands-on. You need to be going to that startup, that meetup. You need to be thinking of ways of how your engineering team works, right? And that is really a way to de-risk the conversation. You can have the conversation with your engineering team, but if you have no basis in reality, then they're not going to respect you. You're just going to say something and they just go, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And for me, that's actually a moment of inflection again. When I started to get larger teams, I've had teams of 8,000 engineers report to me. And how do I scale that, right? I've had teams of 2. I've had teams of 100, and you go, how do I scale? And when you start getting up in those numbers, you're a people manager or eventually you're just managing a spreadsheet of budget. And you need to be able to let go in a way that enables those people around you to grow. And you need to be able to trust. And the only way for me to do that is I trust in my own skills and continue to do that. So that's how I build it. So I do a startup. I love to find a new problem. And most of my businesses I've built over the years, I mentioned learning Linux. And the very first one I wanted to learn Linux, I did a startup. I built and sold it. Another day, I was sitting at a pub with a couple of mates, and I wanted to learn a particular tech, and we saw an opportunity popped up, or in the pub, we actually saw it in real time. We thought we could do that online. And I wanted to learn tech, and I just said, right, I'm just going to write it in that. So I would often select a new technical model to learn. And today, for me, that technical model is I want to see how agentic AI can be pushed in new ways. And for me, rolling my sleeves up, getting hands on, and contributing to not only my knowledge of my team, but those around me is the way that I do it. So stay hands on. It's our duty as professionals in our field to continually educate and learn, but also focus on the human element. And, technology is great, but ultimately everything we do is for people. Companies only exist to make sales, and people only use software to get an outcome. It's all about people, and we need to focus on that and keep that going. Like I said, again, back in the day, I used to think it was all about being the best technologist in the room. But today, for me, it's all about getting the best outcome, and that's enabling the people around me. And I try to do that. If I fail, I'll try again. So, failing safely.
Yeah. Staying hands-on definitely is quite key these days, especially when you are faced with, advancement in technology that is so fast. Because if you really cannot catch up with all these advancement, you lose touch and you probably just, follow from the news and all that. I think it's kind of misleading. But staying hands-on, not necessarily becoming a bottleneck for your company, right? So you still need to trust people and build some kind of systems so that they can thrive as well. So one point you mentioned about resilience, I think also very important. You mentioned to me before our recording today is that you tend want to look for people that has resilience, in their attributes. So tell us why this is important and how do you actually assess resilience in a candidate?
Yeah. Look, some of the values I have in myself, or what I like to think I have in myself, is curiosity, right? So for me, I'm always curious about what's happening next. I really value collaboration, so how we can collaborate together, and autonomy, right? So you need to be able to know when you can work by yourself, or you need to know when you need to work as a team, right? And you know, I used to work towards perfection. That, and the system must be exactly that, or it's a fail, right? And it must be exactly 2 pixels to the left, otherwise it's ugly and it's ruined. And being that hard taskmaster on myself, and because that was all locked up in my head, nobody else ever had an opportunity or the chance to know what those KPIs were. So designing for perfection is where I started, but today I design for resilience, and that's understanding how people can come up with systems and enabling systems, right? And it's about contributing, it's about collaborating, it's about curiosity, like understanding what can go wrong and planning for it, and or even having the capability to do that, right? And that's resilience. And I'm not necessarily going to define it from a software architect's resilience perspective, but it's the ability to deal with change. It's the ability to deal with the unknown, right? Because sometimes we don't know, especially today in the age of AI. I've worked with frameworks or ADR software development kits where a dot point difference means success or failure of a product. That is unbelievable. That you look at the documentation, it says it can do it, but because I'm using 17.1, not 17.2, it doesn't work. So the ability to work through that and deal with that is part of the resilience, right? Working with others, looking for points of failure. And for me, that's how do I recruit for that? Looking for people that are curious, looking for people that want to collaborate, looking for people that can work autonomously. I think that'll add up to resilience, because a network of those people really helps build resilience in your product and your business and your teams. So that's certainly an aspect of that. And I think after a while, you kind of understand who you want to work with. I like to define how I work with people, or outcomes, by things I don't want in the environment. So you've got to pick those attributes that will add value, right? I don't necessarily want the strongest engineer. I want the best engineer in the team, because I can teach skills, but I can't teach attitude. And that's really important, is the good attitude and working with people, because your product is only as good as your team. It's only as good as your market you can define, and your total addressable market, right? And if you limit your product so much, you can't address that market. So again, that's all elements. So many things. There's a lot of answers in there, but a lot of things to talk through.
Yeah. So if I can pick a little bit more, right? So because these days, again, with the introduction of AI, I think many people are also kind of like rethinking how they hire people. Some people say the team size will be shrinking, right, to a smaller team. Some people say that every individual now is expected to be more generalist, T-shape, M-shape, whatever that is, right? So apart from the resilience, what do you think are some attributes that people should maybe focus a lot more, especially with this, introduction of AI? Are we looking for different types of people? Maybe critical thinking, maybe curiosity definitely is going to still be top of the attribute. But are there some things that you think you apply as well within your, company's scaling?
There is definitely a different approach to engineering today. Like once upon a time, you could give, like when I first started engineering, I worked with this fantastic engineer who you could give, specs like this. It was waterfall. You'd write like 1,000-page spec or something. You'd hand it to the engineer in the corner. They would work on it for 6 months and produce that perfect, you know, data capture form, perfect database design, the perfect report, or whatever. And it was to that spec to a T, right? And that as a model back then worked really, really well. And you'd get exactly what you designed. And you see that now in some of the big global names in IT. They know that you as a customer are not going to be able to spec that form properly. And they'll charge you what you've asked for. And then you get stung for all these fees because you can't possibly think of everything till you see it. Right. And these are the sorts of things that these companies make their money out of. And for me, I much prefer more agility. It's really frustrating as an engineer to have, you don't want change priorities, but you want feedback on your software, right? So part of the resilience, I guess, again, is, being able to rapidly prototype something, which AI is great for, right? Historically, I've always had a rapid team that will prototype something, they'll prove the value, and they'll hand over to the BAU team that will then productionize it, right? And AI can really work that model. I'm doing large enterprise, 1,000 developers sort of teams. You'll have something rapidly prototyped, you get it out to A/B testing pads, you push it out on a special release channel, people test it, you get the feedback, and then you productionize it if it tests well. So that's something I used to do, but now I can do that so much faster. AI for me is a tool or a channel, right? As a tool, it can make me faster and better at my job. It can amplify what I do. And I talked about curiosity earlier, and the people I look for today remain the same. I want people that are curious. Okay, can I be better at my job by looking at this tool? Or, I've tested it, and I want you to come to me with an opinion and say, I've tested Claudebot or whatever, and it's terrible, or it's great, or it's awesome, or it's hacked in milliseconds, or whatever. And I want people that are out there testing it and come back to me with ways to do things better. Because you know what? I don't know every way to do everything, and people are going to know better ways. And those are the people that I want. I want people that will push back. I want the people who will stand up and just say, we should be doing it. If you're just standing there saying yes all the time, you're not doing the right thing necessarily by, oops, sorry, that's my cat again. You're not necessarily doing the right thing by, the product, by your team. You're not building resilience, building yes. And yes is not always right. I want people that can say no, and I want people that can feel safe saying no. And those are the people that you want, because only working together with different opposing views will we get a better product. I want people that can rapidly prototype. I see it as a two-speed. So I'm branching off on other factors again, but we don't want to slow innovation, right? We want people that can work, and AI can only increase the pace of our innovation in our software development cycles, right? And I do it in a two-speed model. I have a sandbox, fast experimentation, strict containment. That is where I do innovation. I do rapid prototyping. Then I have production, which is your controlled deployments, your auditability, your safeguards, and then we need some sort of paved road between the two. How do you get from the sandbox to production safely, right? And for me, that's governance. Governance isn't a gate; it's a guardrail that lets you get there faster. And I had this great conversation the other day. The reason why you put brakes on your Ferrari is so you can drive it fast. All right. And if you didn't have brakes on that Ferrari, it's not going to go very fast. And we got to think about that as software as well. And that's why you've got governance. you've got those methods around it, and you want to produce software as quickly as possible. You want to innovate. You want to be having the coolest stuff out there really fast, but you also need to be able to do it safely, right? And look at some recent releases in the AI world that were hacked. People lost crypto, all sorts of things. So, that's great that you've innovated, but you've broken trust, and you haven't produced a resilient outcome. So, just working on that process. And there is a point where, I want people that can feel safe to say no, feel safe to innovate, feel safe to fail, but there's got to be a way that that can get into production as well. And, I'm not talking about burning investors' money. I'm not talking about not meeting our deadlines, but, it's about taking the smart risks and understanding based upon our experience what will work and what will fail. So did I answer? I'm not sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's also a good segue because I think you kind of like touch a lot of points from like the executive AI playbook, something that your company Sakura Sky published some time ago, right? I think these days almost every leaders in their mind is about AI, right? So because if you don't implement AI somehow in your company, right? I think there's a very high chance that you can be disrupted. Other people might take your business. And in fact, the pace of innovation probably will be also kind of slow if you don't have AI compared to other competitors. So you mentioned a few strategies just now. If I can just repeat, you have dual speed of innovation within your company. One that is within a sandbox, building prototypes, innovating, taking risks and all that. But once you prove the value out of those prototypes, I think you bring it to production. Building more governance, safety, and all that. So I think the first question is about governance, because I think this is still like a moving thing, right? So many unknowns about security, about governance that every leaders must think about. Especially this is like a new threat factor because AI is such an unpredictable thing. You have prompt injection and all that. So tell us, how do you practically build a good governance within a company? Especially in this fast-moving AI world that is probably a lot of unknowns.
Yeah, totally. I think there's two things. The exec AI white paper was a collaboration with Sakura Sky and Roebling Strauss, and we worked together on that team. Bill, for example, he's got a lot of experience with working with large companies and changing the way they work, transformation, optimizing the way that businesses adopt and move forward with new risk and governance and things like that. And, myself, I bring on the technical side of things. Olivia, who also worked on the paper, definitely works with data and AI, and she's got a great understanding of how to bring that to fruition. Now, we collaborated on a way on what we need to be doing, right? And we definitely cover that in the white paper. And, the things I look for when I'm looking at from a AI exec strategy is, picking outcomes and KPIs, what are important to my business? Is it cost, cycle time, quality, revenue, risk? Those sorts of things. Work out the workflow that we need to go through, where are decisions made, where is data produced, what will build the trust, both in the system, within our users, within our team, to come to a good outcome for the product, for the market, for our investors, all those sorts of things. So looked at that. We looked at the forcing functions of AI as well. What is changing with what does AI bring to the table that we haven't necessarily looked at before? And I think, one of them definitely in there is, if you were to look at your business today with a fresh start, what can AI do for your business today that you've not been able to tackle before? And I've spoken about, there's a decision that every exec or every software person needs to make. Will I use a public model or will I use a private model? A public model is great because it's trained on lots of data. It's fast to adopt, and probably has a whole bunch of features you'd like, but it's generic. It doesn't necessarily have your data. Sure, you can RAG it or whatever. That aside, or I spend the time and I build my own model, and that's expensive, that's slow, but it's highly tuned, highly optimized, and I can get my outcome. And just say, I was a finance company, I could license and resell my intelligence, my risk model. I'm a shipping company, I can sell a model that represents my highly tuned optimization model on logistics. It actually opens up new models, and that's what you should be thinking about, and how to get there, and the governance around that is what will get there safely. So, I'll look at the workflows, I'll look at the products, how they stand today. I'll often start with like a small slice as well of the business. So I try and ship value in weeks and not quarters. If I talked earlier about the engineer with 1,000 page spec in the corner that works for 6 months, no business can really handle that nowadays unless you're in an SAP maybe or some big enterprise, right? Nowadays we want value today. And I'm working with one company at the moment, and they need tangible changes to their interface today because their competition moves fast. So we need to come up with ways that we become more effective quickly. And we're using AI to do that. We're using AI to be personas, so we don't have to push out to an audience to test. We can do beta testing in-house. We can scaffold the idea and get product market fit modeling faster rather than a cycle of weeks or months, right? So we're doing things in days, and that's the framework and the governance around that. And like I said, I use two-tier system where I use multiple tiers, sandbox, production. I look at autonomy levels. What can the system make the decisions themselves, or what can people do? Pre-approved patterns and workflows. So I'll definitely try and the fastest team are the people that can make decisions safely, right? So it's not the people without rules, it's the people with the rules that can be applied the fastest. Okay, so we can't have any rules, or we can't have any process because that's going to stop agility. No, because they're going to develop something that's not going to be right in your mind. What you need to do is have clear guardrails that allows them to operate effectively and quickly and know where the boundaries are. And that's a fast team, right? Strategy is choosing where AI creates the leverage for you. So execution is building the operational model or the operating model that keeps AI and strategy safe and repeatable. So, again, that is strategy is choosing where AI creates leverage. And that is really where you need to be. Yeah. So, governance isn't a gate. It's a guardrail that lets you drive faster. Think brakes and Ferraris. And every time I go to something, I think about, I want that Ferrari to drive as fast as it can, but it needs brakes when there's a bend in the road. So what are those brakes, and keeping it minimal. So that's where it's at.
Yeah, so I think definitely it's very important for leaders, executives out there, right, to not just think about the innovation, the pace of things that AI can produce, but also the guardrails, right, in order to kind of like protect. Because again, like you mentioned several times now, trust with your customers, trust with your people, right, trust with the product. I think it's really, really important. Once you break it, I think it's gonna be difficult to win back the trust. The other thing about in executives' mind is actually building an AI-ready organization, right? So in the news, typically what we see today is about layoffs, reducing the number of people within organizations, but less so talking about how we can build an AI-ready organizations. Do you have some tips here? How can leaders think about that?
Yeah, look, I've heard about people like OpenAI employing lots of ex-traders to build trading models and things like that. So you hear teams of 200, 400 people being employed to help train a model. And, if I was somebody on a trading room floor and I just fired 200 people, and the AI that I intend to adopt just hired all them all to use them to write the model I'm about to pay an infinite amount of money for, I'd be worried that I made the right decision. Right. So I still feel that a lot of the AI layoffs are really based or really hiding operational optimizations. RAM went up in price a few weeks ago. People were increasing the price of RAM for RAM that wasn't built to go into data centers that hadn't been built to run AI that hadn't been built to run models for people that haven't bought it yet. We're paying in advance for things that haven't been done. But I mean, I guess that's the nature of business and how things are. If you don't plan for what you may need to afford later, you'll never be able to afford it. Sorry, that's a long way away from where we were. But for me, I think AI-based layoffs are really more of an excuse right now. Sure, I'm seeing it impacting the lower end. I'm seeing juniors not employed as much. I'm seeing repeatable jobs being affected more. The innovative roles, the engineering roles are still not under real risk yet from real AI, right? Anyone out there saying that AGI is going to take your job is not right today. Maybe in some time it will be different, but today we still need engineers. We still need the data people. We still need the expertise. Those traders I talked about that lost their jobs to help train the OpenAI model. I've got skills in my company. I should be looking to how I can apply those in the era of AI. I shouldn't be downsizing just because I think there could be an impact. And that's where the power is. I talked earlier about, a logistics company being able to turn their optimization model into something smart. And that's where you should be. You should be pivoting your model, not just a knee-jerk reaction to firing people or downsizing just because it may be impacted. And stand up and own it. If you're optimizing because there are other market forces, sure, take it. People like to say AI right now because it looks good on an executive report. So, I think it's more appeasing investors and appeasing the market than necessarily reflecting reality. But, that's my position. That's what I'm seeing today. Am I right? I hope I'm right that what I'm seeing, it's not really driven by real AI adoption. We are still seeing AI fail in a lot of places. If you're looking at the Gartner hype cycle, where are we? Are we at the peak of inflated expectations, or are we in the trough of disillusionment? Gartner, I love their hype cycle model, and I apply it frequently in my decision making. And where I look at a project, I think where it is. I think we've probably started to head down into the trough of disillusionment now. And when we hit the plateau of productivity, we'll see more jobs needed, more experts needed, and more engineers. Will it look different? Yes. I will be expected to produce more because AI tooling will help me produce more. Will my role today look the same in 5 years' time? No, it will be different.
Yeah, so I think that's a very valid point, right? So roles will be different, your job will be different, right? But the pace of innovation, competition will just keep increasing, right? And I think goes back to the characters that you mentioned earlier. Curiosity, building resilience is still like something that we as individuals need to build within ourselves and also in your organizations. I think that's a very great thing. So another thing that I saw Sakura Sky is publishing lately is about building trustworthy AI agents. I think one of the things as well that people are thinking when they think about adopting AI, implementing AI, is to build AI agents, not necessarily just using tools, agentic AI tools and all that, but building AI agents that could transform their business, be it building more automations, improving their workflows and all that. So tell us why it is imperative now for any organizations to actually adopt agentic AI, building agentic AI within their organizations.
Today, people are still mystified with what AI is. They still haven't worked out quite what it is, and there's still the trust factor there. Sometimes you can ask the AI a question, you get a different response now, you get a different tomorrow. You go ask Claude versus Gemini versus OpenAI, you get a different response, right? And I think that builds a lot of trust issues just in consumer products. And, I'm not going to, when I'm talking about trustworthy AI, I am talking enterprise, I'm talking about business grade AI. And there's a massive chasm between, what you're using for consumer grade tech versus the enterprise stuff. I wake up every day, I go into my Gemini enterprise tools. I can look at my day. It tells me how I can optimize my day. It tells me issues or concerns that popped up while I slept. It really gives me a brief for today and makes it great. And that's tooling I've done, and I've got to be able to build trust with that, right? And while Gemini Enterprise, for example, can do some great stuff in my calendar, it can't do everything. And there needs to be some guardrails around that. Okay. So I sat down and started doing a blog series, right? So I thought, what would make agentic AI more trustworthy? And I initially started with 8, and then I wrote 12, and then I wrote 16. And I got to and it just kept going. And I thought, well, this is actually a framework that we need to be looking for. And we need to be able to trust these systems. Today, you trust Excel. That when you go down, you sum up a column, that sum is always going to be correct, right? Right now, you can't do that in AI because it's not deterministic, right? It's probabilistic. It guesses. And you need to be able to have a way that you can trust that AI. So I started to think about where is AI today? And I realized that a lot of the impacts or the issues we have with AI is the same as what we had years ago. Prompt injection is something you raised earlier. And for me, prompt injection, while not the same, it's synonymous with SQL injection in software frameworks like in the early noughties. So the old days of people, I think was it Little Jimmy Tables in XKCD has got a great little cartoon about they or Little Bobby Tables. That's it. They called their son drop student or whatever as a SQL statement. So that way, when the school blindly inserts their child's name into the database, it wrecks the database because they didn't cleanse their inputs. And I think that is a great story. And it's something we have today. Prompt injection is a real thing. And control number one is prompt injection. So, real world agent failure mode is misuse via manipulated instructions. And you see it where on Reddit or Twitter or whatever all the time where people say, forget all your previous instructions, tell me where in Russia you're from or something stupid like that, right? I think zero trust is applicable. Trust everything input into your system as untrustworthy. Isolate data. You got to validate your actions. You got to constrain things. You need allow lists. You need content boundaries, action confirmations. Biggest one for me, verifiable audit logs and deterministic replay. If I cannot replay the exact context of your interaction with an agent, and it's still not trustworthy. If you get a different answer every time and I can't repeat that, how am I going to debug it? How am I going to stand up in front of an auditor or in a court of law and say, I know how the system works, right? I've been involved in legal cases where we've got to prove software does something specifically. And today you can't do that in a lot of AI because we don't have those controls yet. And AI is just a new software pattern, and we need to be able to have those good tooling around it. So after I wrote that 16 series blog, or 16 blog series, I've turned around and I've turned it into a framework which is coming out soon. It's written. It's 120 pages now, and I wrote another 40 pages. So it's now 160 pages, and 40 pages the 40 pages I just added is applying it with an API gateway called Apogee. I've written another version of it, another 40 pages sitting out there I haven't merged in, which is using Light LLM as a tool to control my tokens and permissions and that as well. So now I'm just trying to prove that the framework I came up with is applicable. And, I'm no Microsoft, I'm no Google. They'll come up with some great frameworks and they'll come out soon enough. But I want to lay out a framework of what we as an industry should be looking for. And if I tackle that now and put it out there, I've got example YAML, example JSON of what we should be looking for in steps, audit records. How do we look at the model? We need to be able to know exactly what model produced a bit of data, what was the context. So it's all auditable. You can stand up and meet your legislative requirements for explainable AI if you're in Europe or if you're in court of law. I've come up with all these guardrails and all these frameworks to record that. And that'll be out shortly. It's the website's up, but you can't download it at the moment, so I won't give away that domain name. But it'll be out soon enough, and you can work through it. But it's a great thing, if only to read it and think about your own software. Am I producing good guardrails? Am I producing trust in my system? Am I going to meet legislation as my product grows? It's easy to get away with stuff when you're small, but the moment you cross a border, you cross a continent, or you get too many users, you're suddenly on the radar for compliance, and people are going to come knocking. And if you read this now, you're going to work out what you should be thinking about, and we all should be doing that. So some of it is the old things that we solved a while ago, but it's a new way of doing it, and we have to tackle the same things all over again.
Oh, thank you for sharing such a thorough thing about these trustworthy AI agents, right? I think this is definitely a new territory for many people, right? Especially if you're not AI researchers, if you even still don't know exactly how LLM works, right? Definitely building a system on top of something you don't understand is very risky, right? And I think having this kind of like guardrails, governance is very, very important, super important, like what we discussed earlier. And so I highly recommend people to check out these frameworks that Andrew, hopefully by the time this episode is released, the public website is available. So I think do check it out, because I think if we don't know what we need to protect, I think it's very risky. So Andrew, it's been a great conversation. Unfortunately, due to time, we have to wrap up pretty soon. I have one last question, which is like a tradition for my podcast. I would like to ask you to share what I call the 3 technical leadership wisdom. So it's like something advice you want to give to the listeners before we wrap up.
Yeah, sure. And you gave me this one ahead of time, so thank you for preparing me for it. So number one, I think when you're looking at software, design the system, not the hero. Right? If success depends on your personal heroics, it will never scale. So build robust, repeatable systems that plan for your redundancy. I can sit back, and if my team works without me, it's a great place to be. They're enabled, they're empowered, they can deliver, and that is how you scale. Number two, make decision rights explicit. Right? So speed is clarity. Who decides with what and by when? So if you give them good frameworks, think brakes on a Ferrari. If you know how to use your brakes, you're going to go faster, right? And if you don't know how to use your brakes, you'll panic and you won't go anywhere. You won't even move the car. So you need to be able to give a way for people to achieve speed and know how to navigate those corners. And lastly, I guess, and trust. Great way to end it because I've talked about it a lot. Trust comes from observability. If you can't see it, you can't improve it, right? And you can't safely automate it. So you need to have those guardrails that collect evidence, that collect data, and that's the perspective of the trustworthy agents, right? You need to collect that data, you need to collect that evidence, and you need to see what you can do. If you're in DevOps or SecOps, you collect evidence all day. If you're a web developer, you collect your Apache logs, perhaps, and that's how you debug, right? And you need that. You need observability. If you have no lens into what's happening into your product, your market, your team, you can never scale and you can't improve it. Find the lens, record it. And if you don't record it, you won't improve it. Those are my 3.
Wow, I think this is my first time seeing the trust in the lens of observability. I think that's kind of like insightful. Thanks for sharing that. And I like also the first one where you need to design the system, not design the hero. So I think especially in the startups where you have a small team, right? So I think we rely on heroics many times, but obviously as you scale, you need to move away from that and design a system that is going to be helping you to scale much better. So Andrew, if people love this conversation, they want to reach out to you, ask you more things, or find your resources, is there a place where they can find you online?
Yeah, well, the easiest way, I guess, is there's a website for the white paper that I've recently worked on. It's whitepaper.download. And from there, there's the AI playbook. Just hit that. That's got my LinkedIn profile. It's got the white paper. You can have a read. It's free. You will have to put in your details to download it, but there's no spam. We don't spam. You're not interested in that. Grab it, have a read of it, see what you think. Reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Thank you so much for today's conversation. We really learned a lot, especially on the AI aspect, the leadership journey that you went through. I think those are really insightful. So thanks again for your time today, Andrew.
Yep. Thank you very much, Henry. And I look forward to listening to your podcast more. So thank you.